Now, from CBS News Miami, this is Facing South Florida with Jim DeFede.
Welcome to Facing South Florida. I'm Jim DeFede. This year, property taxes will likely take center stage in the Florida Legislature. Now, in a few minutes, we will hear from State Representative Vicki Lopez. She chairs a committee looking at changes to the property tax system that will likely be on the 2026 ballot. Those changes could range from increasing homestead exemptions to eliminating property taxes entirely. The governor has certainly made clear he'd like to eliminate them. Listen to the way he views property taxes.
When it comes to owning your home, though, for some reason, they don't give you a choice in that. You own your property, you own your house, and yet you got to perpetually pay, which is effectively pay taxes, which is effectively rent to the government, just to be able to live on your property. If you stop paying the property tax, they could take your property. And so that's wrong.
Now, there are those who might think the governor is pandering to the public and isn't really being honest with folks. And you might think this is an attempt to remain relevant as he enters his final legislative session. Who knows? But I get it. No one likes paying taxes, or as he calls it, rent. But when you live in a community, you enjoy certain benefits. You want police and fire protection. You want safe roads. You want your garbage picked up. You want bus service to help you get to work. You want to know that when you get into an elevator, it was hopefully inspected in the last year, or that the building you are sleeping in isn't going to collapse in the middle of the night. Maybe you want your kids to be able to play in a clean and safe park, or go to a library or a museum. Things that often help increase the value of your property. Now, I've paid tens of thousands of dollars in property taxes over the 25 years I've owned my house to the school system in Miami-Dade County, even though I don't have kids. But I recognize having kids educated benefits the society in which I live. And let's not forget, there is no income tax in Florida. But as I said, nobody likes paying taxes. But when the governor or anyone tells you you can have the things that local government is responsible for without having to pay for them, don't believe them. What's the old adage? If a deal seems too good to be true, it probably is. Now, the legislature is wrestling with a lot of these questions. House Speaker Danny Perez created a committee to look at ways to reform property taxes, and the chair of that committee is State Representative Vicki Lopez from Miami.
So where we are is we have spent since May of this past year actually educating ourselves. We have 37 members on my committee, and our role has been to educate not only us, but the members of the legislature. And hopefully the public has been watching because it's been quite informative. We've learned things that none of us knew about property taxes. And so we were on more of an educational, I think, a phase. We are now getting to the point where we can actually begin to see that there are ways in which we can bring some relief to some of our homestead homeowners. So there will be legislative fixes that we can do, and then there will be constitutional amendments that need to be placed on the ballot.
So when you say that there were certain things that were surprising that you learned through this process, give us an example of that. What would the public be surprised to learn about what the state of property taxes are?
I like to use the story of my own district. I have a barrier island, the village of Key Biscayne, and I learned that 50% of their ad valorem budget is used for public safety, which is the number one issue in Florida. People want to know that they can live in a state that has law and order and that also has a priority for fire and fire rescue. So you're starting to learn a little bit more. I think when people hear, let's eliminate homestead property taxes, I think my goal is to ensure that every voter who will vote on a constitutional amendment is actually well informed about consequences to that decision.
That seems to be the impression that the governor is giving, is that we can just sort of do away with property taxes. Is he misleading the public?
I think that if he could come up with a plan, we certainly would entertain it. But right now, all we know is that he's saying, let's eliminate them altogether. What I worry about is, and I'll go back to the village of Key Biscayne as an example, their ad valorem taxes for homestead revenue is $11 million. Now, the island would never be able to find $11 million in their budget because they run a very lean and mean budget. They also just reduced their millage this year. So they would have to, the consequence would be that many municipalities may find themselves having to roll back into the county, which goes contrary to why they incorporated in the first place. So I think if hopefully the governor has been watching our committee, because what we're seeing is a county like Okeechobee County, one of our fiscally constrained counties, does not fund anything at all other than what is essential. And a committee member asked them, well, how much do you fund for your nonprofits? And they said, we don't fund any nonprofit. We don't have the money to do that. So then that next question is, will some of these fiscally constrained counties cease to exist? In other words, would we have to combine counties so that it would be a larger unincorporated area? So these are...
Yeah, well, I appreciate the concern for the fiscally constrained counties, which is probably a nice way of saying counties that receive more probably from the state as well than other counties that give. Because, for instance, I think Dade County, Broward County, Palm Beach counties are probably considered donor counties. In other words, they send more money to Tallahassee than they receive back.
That's
so
correct.
For those larger counties like Miami-Dade, like Broward County, after when we're done with this interview, we're going to air an interview that I did with Steve Geller, the Broward County Commissioner, and he's critical because he says, the governor argues that we've got a $9 billion budget, so that if we cut out the property taxes, which is about $1.8 billion, we should be able to make that up. But that's not in reality. In reality, $7 billion of that $9 billion are tied up with the seaport, airport, capital programs that they can sort of touch, things that are not discretionary. The only part of their budget that is general revenue is about $2 billion, and they collect $1.8 billion in property taxes. So if you eliminate that, how do you pay for police, for fire? And I guess that's the bigger question, and I apologize for talking so long, but I guess that's the bigger question is, nobody likes to pay taxes, but everyone wants the services that those taxes provide.
Well, no,
That's the problem, right?
That leads to a fundamental question of if everyone is contributing today to property taxes, whether you are a commercial enterprise, whether you own residential that you don't homestead, or homestead, right? So we're spreading the wealth across everyone who uses services. So the fundamental question when you say you're going to eliminate property taxes, the question has to be posed is, so what you're saying is that homestead property owners should not contribute to the very services that they receive, such as solid waste, public safety, roads, infrastructure. So that's a fundamental question, whether or not who should be paying for this. But then the question is not about elimination. It's really a cost shift. Because if you're going to eliminate property taxes, you have to make it up. Now, I know that the governor and some of the DOGE efforts are saying you don't have to do anything. There's so much waste in government that you don't have to make it up. Now, that's difficult to understand because I'm telling you that I see some budgets and they are lean and mean. So again, the village of Key Biscayne will be forced to come back to the county, as will, remember, we have 34 municipalities in our county. Some of them are small cities. So the decision that they made to incorporate, to provide better, higher quality services to themselves will cease because they won't have a choice. So, I think that for the larger counties, we've also experienced high growth in those large counties, right? So we have more people needing more services. And we've also, experienced inflation, 40% inflation on any capital project. So what would have cost $5 million 5 years ago is now costing nearly 10 or 15 million. So costs have gone up. So I will tell you that I think one of the things that we have learned is just how complicated and complex this particular subject matter really is.
This is where I'm guessing a little bit as to what is likely to come out of this, and I realize you may not want to prejudge as you're sort of working your way through this, but it seems to me that we're likely to see some measure on the ballot in 26 that will extend those homestead exemptions. Maybe $100,000 for new home buyers, or maybe increasing exemptions in other areas for seniors or for other specific groups. Is it that sort of targeted approach that you think will eventually make its way onto the ballot, as opposed to a line that sort of says, we will remove property taxes for anyone declaring a homestead exemption.
I agree with you. I think we will be looking at targeting who needs this relief most, right? I mean, we are very sensitive to those retirees that are on a fixed income and whose values of property have increased exponentially, and now so is not their property taxes. So I think what we will see, look, a lot of this has not been updated in many years, right? So exemptions that were at 25,000 for the first, 50 to 75, then an additional one, it's complex. Why don't we just do one larger exemption for everyone, right? So maybe we get to $100,000 as a homestead exemption. We're also looking at portability. It's one of the biggest problems we have. Retirees or people that are now living in very large homes that wish to move to a smaller place have found themselves not able to do so because the portability is only at $500,000. And in Miami-Dade, that matters. In Holmes County, where a home isn't even worth $500,000, it may not matter. So we may have to start looking at percentages to make it fair and equitable across the board. And look, there are. I learned this week from our property appraiser's office that they have found people that didn't even know that they qualified for an exemption, like widows whose husband passed away and didn't think to even continue to provide for their homestead. So we have to look at I think it's going to be several. And I say that, not just one constitutional amendment. I think there may be several constitutional amendments placed on the ballot, as well as some legislative fixes that will help people.
Now, obviously, anything that you do that decreases the amount of money coming into cities and counties, those cities and counties then have to deal with in their budget process.
I'm so glad you brought that up, because here's what I've been telling cities and counties. You have to start modeling now some sort of budget models. You have to start saying, if there's a 10% decrease, right? What do I have to do? Because I think for the voter, they need to know what the impacts will be in their local communities. So I'm telling them, start modeling it, 10% decrease, 20%, get to almost 75%, because that'll be a good gauge as to what do you have to do. And that's going to actually then lend itself to conversations for small municipalities of, will we be able to do a 10% cut or 20 or 30, or do we have to start making, plans to roll back into counties?
Now, I feel like I've got to ask this question because it almost seems teed up at this point. You as a legislator right now are potentially passing some measures that will affect county commissions, and yet I keep hearing that you're interested in potentially being on the Miami-Dade County Commission. Eileen Higgins obviously is running for mayor, so she's leaving her position. Is that a position you're interested in? Because I'm hearing that there's a little lobbying going on for you right now to take that, to get appointed to that seat by the other commissioners.
Look, I will say this. I'm flattered that people have thought that my work at the legislature in the last 3 years does tee me up for a local county commission. I started my career as a local county commissioner. So it's one of the reasons why I am so sensitive about how this work could in fact impact counties and cities. We shall wait and see what the county commission does in order to fill that seat. But as of today, Eileen still remains my county commissioner. And so we'll see what the future holds.
Is that a position though that you want?
It's a position that I'm interested in, that I would obviously entertain, yes.
When we come back, one way the governor is making the case to slash property taxes is by accusing blue counties of wasteful spending, and he is singling out Broward County. We'll talk to County Commissioner Stephen Geller about the governor's DOGE efforts. Stay with us. Welcome back. Governor Ron DeSantis and the state's chief financial officer, Blaise Ngaya, recently released a report criticizing a number of cities and counties with what they claimed was waste, fraud, and abuse. Buzzwords made famous by Elon Musk. DeSantis created his own DOGE task force, and one of the targets was Broward County, which he criticized because it spent $890,000 since 2020 on DEI training. First, it's important to note that once the Florida Legislature outlawed DEI training, Broward stopped, so it's not even an issue anymore. And as we saw with Elon Musk and the federal level, the goal doesn't really seem to be rooting out waste, fraud, or abuse, as much as it is attacking policies they don't like. This week, I spoke to Broward County Commissioner Stephen Geller about what the governor is doing.
I think the governor is staking his political future on being the guy that eliminated property taxes, and therefore he is trying to DOGE everybody to say how horrible free spending governments are. And I can't speak for governments outside of Broward County, but I can say he's wrong about Broward County. Let me elaborate. The governor has said that Broward County's budget is around $9 billion and that property taxes are around $1.8 billion, meaning it's only around 20%. And since Broward is this horribly overspending government, we can just tighten our belts and eliminate property taxes because it's only 20% of our budget, and we wouldn't defund the police or anything else. The governor is fundamentally wrong. The chief financial officer recognizes that the real number is only $2 billion, which is our general revenue fund. And that's where we pay for police, parks, libraries, and everything else. And if it's $2 billion, you can't take $1.8 billion out of it, which is what we would lose from property taxes, without defunding the police and eliminating parks and libraries. I did not vote to defund the police when the Black Lives Matter group asked us to, and I'm not going to vote to defund the police when Governor DeSantis asks us to.
It seems as if a lot of what the governor and the chief financial officer want to hone in on really are not issues of waste, fraud, and abuse, which has just become this catch-all phrase to just encompass anything and everything that the governor or the CFO or in the national level, the case of the president, simply don't like as a matter of policy. And they cite in the case of Broward County that you spent about $890,000 on DEI training since 2020. Now, again, Ron DeSantis may not think that DEI training is good or important or has any place in it, but you know, in Broward, you may feel differently. And if the voters don't agree with you that that's a proper use of money, they would vote you out. How much of this do you think is just simply policy differences based on political ideology?
I think it's all policy differences. I don't believe I could be elected statewide if I was running for governor. And I don't believe that Governor DeSantis or Chief Financial Officer Ingoglia could win a seat on the Broward County Commission. That doesn't mean that our priorities are wrong, doesn't mean that their priorities are wrong. It means that the local voters who elected us in Broward County should be able to make their own choices. You mentioned one. I'm going to skip the DEI because that's the most complicated one. The other two examples he gave was one, something that implied we'd sent money to the United Nations. The United Nations passed something on the status of women. Broward County hired FIU to do a study on the status of women. We sent our money not to the United Nations, but to FIU to do a study to see if there was unfair discrimination or racial or sexual violence against women, and to see what steps we could take. The other thing he gave an example of was we spent some money to put our public art projects on the metaverse so people could take a look at that.
Let me just jump in. It was $175,000. And essentially, as I understand it from looking at it myself, it was a way in which if you were homebound or if you lived outside of Broward County and wanted to sort of explore the cultural aspects of Broward County and some of its art exhibitions, that is available to you by using that technology so that you could see it.
That is completely correct. Completely correct. Let me say two quick things. Number one, art helps bring in tourists to Broward County, art and culture. And number two, when I'm trying to recruit CEOs of large national companies to move here, one of the things that they always ask is, do you have a symphony? Do you have museums? Do you have theater? We're putting out on the internet to show that we have these things. These are economic development agents, and the governor should not be disagreeing with those. Those do reflect Broward County values.
Why do you think he's
By the
going
way,
after
the
Broward
governor
County?
and the CFO have different ways of calculating this. You need to be aware. The governor is saying we have a $9 billion budget. The CFO is correctly saying it's $2 billion.
But again, just to stick for that for a second, the amount that you collect in property taxes is about 1.8 billion. Is that correct?
That's correct. That's correct.
And that 2 billion, of that 2 billion, what percentage of that goes to police and fire, public safety issues?
According to a letter from Attorney General Rothmeyer to our sheriff, it's 56%. It's definitely in the low to mid 50s, depending on what you include. If you're including 911, for example, which I think you should, our 911 technology, but it's well over 50%. So there is no way, if we have a $2 billion general revenue budget, of which $250 million is reserves, and we get $1.8 billion in property taxes, and we're sending, the majority of that, of the 1.8, we're spending on police, fire, first responders. It's impossible to eliminate property taxes and not defund the police and fire, period. End of story.
This notion of going after Broward County in particular, the governor has visited, has railed against Broward County. Why do you think he's focused so heavily on Broward County, on Jacksonville, on Orlando? What do you think the common denominator is there?
Broward County is the largest Democratic county in the state of Florida. The day the governor announced DOGE, before he had done anything, he issued a press release on Broward County overspending before he had any bit of data. I mean, the legislature keeps passing unfunded mandates down to the county, making us do additional things. The homeless, we have to spend more on homelessness now than we used to, because the legislature passed a law that said if a business has somebody in front of them, a homeless person, and they complain, and local government doesn't do something about it, they could sue local government and get damages. So the cities and counties are having to put more money into places to locate the homeless or to arrest them. So that's costing us more money. Legislature didn't give us any money for that. They need to stop passing mandates on local government that cost us more money and then complain that we're spending more money, which is what they're doing. We didn't do that nearly as much during the 20 years I was in the legislature. When I was there, it seemed like we treated local governments as our friends and partners representing the same people. Over the past 10 years or 15 years, it's got to seem more like the state is treating local government like the enemy, and I don't understand why.
Next week, I'm sitting down with the state's new CFO, Blazin Gallia, to get his perspective. You can see that interview next Sunday. We'll be right back after the break. Well, that's all the time we have today. If you have any thoughts or comments, feel free to contact me at jdefede@cbs.com. I do enjoy hearing from you. Thanks again for watching, and enjoy the rest of your day.